Welcome along. I'm back, as the former governor of California might have said if he'd have won re-election. So yes, following a delay due to or a postponement due to various technical problems, I'm back doing regular live streams again. Thought I'd jump on quickly this evening just to run through a few things. Starting off, of course, with the latest from the never-ending parade of madness coming out. Maybe we'll find time for Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson having his premiership nearly destroyed by being ambushed with a cake, and any questions that anybody's got as well. But we'll start off with latest from the Ukraine war, obviously, the news that everybody is slowly forgetting. And what I wanted to talk about tonight was just a little bit about the various narratives taking shape around like what the Russians are actually doing and the tactics, the way a lot of people who are wanting the Russians to pull off a victory are starting to panic and screaming that Putin needs to mobilize en masse. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I don't think he's going to do that, and why I don't think that the Russians will actually need to do that. So let's revisit. It's been a couple of months since I did a live stream on this, so where are we? Now, at the end of February, Putin, following his recognition of the two self-declared People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, the predominantly Russian-speaking areas in the far east of Ukraine, he recognized those two countries as independent states, and then 2 days later launched what he called the special military operation, which he said was going to be about demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine. And to that end, including all the politicians, they all thought Ukraine would collapse in about 72 hours. The Russians would roll straight in. And in the initial period, it looked like that was going to happen. There was a concerted push, at least it appeared to be a concerted push towards Kiev by a column of Russian troops. There was a Russian paratrooper landing at Gostomel airport, just north of Kiev, I believe. And it appeared as if the Ukrainian state was going to collapse. It didn't, for a variety of reasons, which I'll go into. And following then some, should we say, toing and froing, the Russian operation then clearly shifted gears. So let's look at what happened in that initial phase. Because why did Ukraine's ostensible allies, or in reality, puppet masters in Washington and London, believe that the Ukrainian state was going to collapse within 72 hours? And the Russians forecasts as well. And it would be that the Russians would use a lot more men and equipment and would be unleashing a more, shall we say, full-on aggressive warfare on Ukraine, the kind that the US used on Iraq in 2003. Shock and awe tactics, mass, almost saturation bombing of cities, and air power than the Russians have displayed so far. The idea of that being their assault plan, you could easily see why. And Ukraine doesn't collapse. The Ukrainian state is around that. Interpretations that have been going around out there. Military professionals, retired professionals, have commented that it might have been a feint explanation that Vladimir Putin gave just before he launched, being given prominent positions within the Ukrainian military and state forces, to remove them, and then for this new military regime in Ukraine to then strike a bargain with them. And it would seem that Putin's intelligence operation, the Russian intelligence operation, had given him fairly good reason to believe, or fairly good, strong reasoning, was a chance that there would be a coup if the Russians made a quick run on Kiev, that the military men would then step up and or take Zelensky out of the picture, depose the neo-fascist commanders, and essentially return Ukraine to its pre-2014 state. And this could be achieved by essentially panicking Ukrainians into deposing the Maidan government. And this ended up not happening. We don't know as yet how close this did come to happening, or if the Russian calculation was in any way accurate. But certainly this is something that Putin, by addressing it in his speech before the launch of the operation, by openly making an appeal to the Ukrainian general staff, by in the early stages of the special military operation, not launching mass artillery and air attacks on Ukrainian troops in barracks, which they could have done. They certainly seemed to think that they stood a chance of attaining a coup run by the Ukrainian general staff. That didn't materialize. Zelensky didn't appear, at least, to quit and run away, though who knows where he is on any given time. He certainly appears for publicity photos in Kiev. Whether he's there all the time is another question. And of course, then you get this reorientation towards taking the Donbass. And not only do you get that, but you get also the fact that this operation appears to be going very slowly. This is causing all manner of chagrin to erupt on the various Russian nationalist Telegram channels. If you follow those, you can see that my description of Vladimir Putin as a liberal is very accurate, in that if you look at who Putin's actual domestic opposition is, it's various forms of Russian nationalist, be they from the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, or it being monarchists, or various forms of bourgeois or petty bourgeois Russian nationalists, all of whom are far further over to the nationalistic and militaristic side than he is, and many of whom would have gone into Ukraine during a full-on invasion in 2014. Now, of course, he didn't do that. And this criticism is also coming from people like Ritter and others who in America are now critiquing the Russian operation and saying that they're using too small a force, that they're going too slow, that this slow maneuver that they're engaging in is going to give Ukraine a chance to rebuild their forces and bog the Russians down in an operation which will last much longer and will inevitably cause a huge amount of casualties, and that they need to the common criticism now from everybody from I've seen Mark Sloboda say this, I've seen Ritter say it, and a lot of other Western military professionals say it, that they need to mobilize, that they need to commit more forces, that they need to knock Ukraine out of the war, basically, before Ukraine has the opportunity to form new armies in the West and then bring their newly arrived Western military equipment to bear upon the Russian forces in the east. And I can understand the logic of this argument. Certainly it seems the tactics that the Russians are using do seem rather strange. I'm going to attempt to explain what I believe is going on. And first of all is that you have to look at this not just in the military sense, but in the political sense. And in the political sense, what is the Russian government? First of all, what is the nature of the Russian government? Because again, of course, the morons in the parliament in Westminster and the potentially even bigger morons in the U.S. Congress are all screaming that. I mean, I saw this goofball GOP representative, what's his name, Kennedy, on the news today saying that Putin had the bloodlust of Stalin and was looking to reform the Soviet Union and take over the world with Iran and China. I mean, he was reading off a list of talking points that had been clearly shoved under his nose, and he was too stupid or too partisan to question them. All these idiots project onto Putin's Russian Federation the various state formations of Russia's gone by, like it's the Tsardom, it's Ivan the Terrible, it's Stalin, all of which is ludicrous. But as I've said before, people who are opponents of the West, the American-led order, also project onto Putin's Russia things that aren't there as well. Let's be clear. Putin's Russia is a modern capitalist state. It is not the backward, chaotic state that existed in the 1990s. It is not some kind of like Soviet revanchist regime. It's not a Nazbol state being run by the ghost of Eduard Limonov and Alexander Dugin, much to Alexander Dugin's frustration. Follow his Telegram channel, by the way, very entertaining. It's a modern capitalist state, and you can find out more about this, about the changes that Putin has made to Russian economy and society by listening to an interview we've got coming out on the podcast tomorrow with somebody who's written extensively on Putin's time in office, Natalie Baldwin. We talk there about Putin's changes to the economy and state. I will outline a couple of those briefly now. Putin has been mischaracterized from the very beginning of his rule. Many now on the European and American left characterize him as some sort of Western agent who has gone rogue, and I don't think it's accurate to say that he was ever that. He is what he always has been, which is he's a representative of a certain faction within the Russian capitalist class, or at least he's a political expression of them. And he comes in at the very end of the 90s as one of Yeltsin's revolving door of prime ministers. Yeltsin is disposed of by the faction to which Putin belonged, which is largely the sort of faction consisting of a lot of security men, military men, etc. And Putin is put in place because the Russian state, by the end of the 1990s, is facing an existential crisis. And what I mean by that is it's facing an existential crisis in the form of it has a war in Chechnya, which it is not winning. It has a dangerous insurgent Islamic terrorist campaign stemming out of that. It has huge economic problems. And it is in a state where it cannot basically enforce the rule of law across the country. Now, if you look at the things in which a successful capitalist nation needs out of its state machine, it needs to create and recreate the conditions for successful capital accumulation. Now, what Russia had in the 1990s was conditions for successful looting. And what I mean by that is it had conditions whereby, because of the ludicrous and deeply corrupt way the state property of the former Soviet Union was disposed of by the deeply corrupt Yeltsin government in the 1990s, by the reduction of the Russian working class to abject penury by the mid-1990s, enabled a collection of their, referred to now as the oligarchs, to snap up at bargain basement prices a lot of like former Soviet heavy industry and make fortunes out of either asset stripping it or time. You do get the beginnings of or Roman Abramovich, who are just simply looters. You do get a domestic set of capitalists begin to emerge. And what they want is a state which is corrupt local officials or warlords in order to actually make some money. Okay, apparently we've got significant connection problems. I'm going to blame MI6. And we're going to continue. Thank you, Massimiliano Urbani says your net's crapping itself. Yeah, well, unfortunately, yes, I will try and address that for the next one later if you can't see it now. So, as I was saying, what the capitalists needed in order to actually make Russian capitalism work was a state that could enforce the gangsterism, because there was a lot of that in Russia in the 90s. And the overwhelming need was for the state to be stable and secure, to be able to carry out its job of protecting the rights of capital, and also making sure the state things that Putin does when he comes in is that he starts to pay attention to the law and order question. And it doesn't just deal with that through simple repression. He also engages in what I would call taxes. Spends a lot of the oil and gas revenue, it turns out rather wisely, which is rather than using it as investment, he actually pays off the IMF debts that have been incurred by the Yeltsin presidency in the 1990s, and that's crucial for where Russia is now. Now, I'm saying all of this, but go and listen to the interview we've done with Natalie Baldwin tomorrow when it comes out. A lot more detail in there, because this is Putin's project is to create a stable Russian state, which is as sovereign as he can make it, which is to say that it's as not exposed as possible to the should we say the trials and tribulations that will come from being heavily indebted to US institutions, which is what the International Monetary Fund is. For all the fancy title, it is a US British institution, which if you are in debt to it, can basically destroy you. And that's why a few years ago, when Lenin Moreno, the very poorly named president of Ecuador, came in, nominally as a left candidate, but turned out to be a right candidate, or a right something. One of the first things he does when coming in is he takes an IMF loan when they don't really need it. And why does he take an IMF loan? He takes that loan because he's been told that it's a good thing to do, that it will get him certain favors from the United States. But in reality, the United States wants countries like Ecuador and everybody else to take IMF loans, because it basically means that your economy is then mortgaged, and you are subject to the even further control. That's why he pays off the debt. And this leads me back to the point about the military campaign. Putin, Vladimir Putin, is not the Tsar. He's not, Ivan the Terrible or Alexander the First. He's not running some mass mobilization peasant army. He's not running the Red Army in 1941. This is not some, even though there is conscription in Russia, of course, it's his military reforms have focused on creating a smaller, more professional military force. Now look at who's doing the fighting in the Donbass at the moment. Principally, a lot of them, between 44 to 50,000, are the armies of the Luhansk and the Donetsk People's Republics, who are now very well equipped thanks to the generous donations of NATO. It's volunteer units that have been trained in Chechnya. It's Chechen units supported by, of course, the heavy artillery of the Russian army, the Russian Air Force and Navy. And huge numbers of Russian forces remain outside of the Ukrainian combat zone in various areas inside the Russian Federation itself, waiting in reserve. Now, why is the Russian command, why is Putin himself running such a small-scale operation? In relative terms, it's the actual number of troops involved, the estimates vary, but it's no more than 200,000. Bear in mind, Ukraine had a potential military capacity at the start of this operation of around about 600,000. So why are they employing such relatively small numbers and attacking a force that could in theory outnumber them 3-1, though in practice actually doesn't? In practice, in what was actually going on prior to the beginning of the Russian special military operation was that there was around about 60 to 80,000 Ukrainian troops stationed ready to attack the two republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. And this is something which is important to bear in mind. I'll come back to it later. But the reason why that they are using relatively small forces Reason why they are focusing principally on the Donbass areas, the two republics there, is that, of course, that was the initial stimulus for the actual beginning of this operation. Putin talked about denazifying and demilitarizing Ukraine, talks about Ukraine's NATO membership, and of course, all those things are very important. But what was actually the final trigger for it was the Ukrainians, as on the orders of Washington and London, were preparing for a large-scale offensive against Donetsk and Lugansk. And you can tell this and by looking at the dispositions of the Ukrainian forces, the fact that we have accurate reporting that they've engaged in a huge number of ceasefire, supposed ceasefire violations in the days immediately preceding the launch of the Russian operation. There's an analysis that's been very widely shared across social media platforms by a former Swiss military intelligence officer, a guy named Jacques Beau, who points out that there was a speech by Zelensky in the later part of 2021, where he talked about that they were going to reconquer the independent republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, and they were also going to reconquer Crimea. Could be just the cocaine talking, but Zelensky did say that. And then, of course, they got all of the best equipped and trained Ukrainian troops on the contact line or just near the contact line prior to the launch of the Russian operation. It was clear that the Russians, or the Russian high command, believed that the Ukrainians were about to launch a full-scale assault on the two Donbass republics. And of course, Putin has been under considerable pressure domestically from the more nationalistic opponents of his inside Russia, including those who have been launching very large demonstrations in places like Moscow, calling for the launch of a war to liberate Donbass. And of course, these demonstrations are never shown on Western television. We only get to see the 10 idiots who turn out for Alexei Navalny. In reality, the actual opposition to Putin in Russia comes much more from more nationalistic forces, as I was saying earlier. So Putin's under a lot of pressure to act from the domestic population, from people in the security and military world in which he inhabits. And so he has to do something. But being the very cautious man that he is, and he remains a very cautious leader, no matter what the insane things that are attributed to him by the Western press, he launches an operation using a minimal number of forces that's principally dependent upon the forces of Donetsk and Lugansk, who declared a general mobilization, of course, supported by the Russian air power and artillery fire. And what the operation is doing, from what I can tell, and I spend an awful lot of time looking at various Russian language sources on this, that I use my incredibly rudimentary knowledge of Russian plus Google Translate to look at. From what you can tell from looking at this, the Russians have an enormous advantage in terms of artillery in it, and of course near complete air supremacy. So they can basically shell to death all of these Ukrainian positions in the east of Ukraine. And after the first few days, where the Russians made a lot of rapid advances, and a lot of these columns that were advancing got cut off, and that's where a lot of Russian soldiers ended up getting taken prisoner, they reverted to these very slow-paced tactics, where they would launch relentless artillery barrages on the Ukrainian positions, a lot of air attacks, a lot of cruise missile attacks, and then they would, once these positions had been pounded into the dirt, they would then use their tanks to go through and their infantry to clean up. And this is proving successful for them. It's proving very slow in that they're not using like massive amounts, that they're nowhere near the potential full armor and infantry capacity that the Russian army could wield. But they are, by using their superior firepower, basically grinding down the Ukrainian army. And you can tell that things are going very wrong for the Ukrainian army, because first of all, of course, you have the symbolic surrender of the Azov and the other Ukrainian forces at the basement of the the steelworks in Mariupol, Azovstal. And of course, the fact that the Ukrainians are on their fourth wave of mobilization. They're losing a lot of men in the east, and far more than they are admitting. And you have now disputes breaking out between the Ukrainian general staff and Zelensky, though in reality, whoever is pulling Zelensky's strings in the British Ministry of Defense and the American Pentagon, and that the Ukrainian generals want to pull their men out of places like Slavyansk to avoid them getting encircled and destroyed, which is what keeps happening to Ukrainian forces. If you look at the developing maps that you can see online, the more reliable of them, of course, you can see that the Russians shell somewhere to death, slowly advance around it, create a small cauldron, finish off or force to surrender whoever is in there, and move on. And again, this isn't like vast, sweeping, rapid movements. This is small scale and slow, but relentless. So you can see that they took the other day the very strategically important town of city of Popasnaya, and this opens up a series of roadways into the rest of the areas of Donbass that they're looking to take. And of course, President Jesus says Malcolm Nance might actually get to see some action. We can only hope. We can only hope, because he was done talking. I do hope that he gets to the first profound wish, which is to probably wildly fire at a Russian tank before running away. So this slow rolling advance, which they are using, again, with a lot of the fighting being done by the forces of the two Donbass republics themselves, and various Chechen units, and also the Wagner mercenary group, which is a sort of semi-state organization linked to the Russian Ministry of Defense, and also semi-private, operates in a lot of war zones across Africa and the Middle East and various other places that the Russians have interests that they want to act upon, but don't want to put an official force in. And these tactics are being effective. Not only are they grinding Ukrainian forces down, causing a lot of casualties, causing a lot of causing splits to emerge within the Ukrainian military and political hierarchy. They're also causing problems for the Europeans and the United States. And this is where I think what needs to be kept in mind is that a longer war actually suits the Russians better than the Americans or the Europeans, because according to most independent calculations, not only is Russia self-financing now, they have very little external debt. They have a trade surplus and a budget surplus. They are self-sustaining when it comes to food. The sanctions of the West are not causing anything like the damage that the Americans, the British, and the others who were imposing them thought they would cause. Russian oil is still being sold extensively all the way across Europe. Any shortfalls in that caused by sanctions or boycotts is being picked up by buyers in Asia and Southeast Asia. The sanctions regime is a failure, a complete failure. And as this goes on, what you will see is the reason why this war at the moment, with its relatively small deployment of Russian forces, suits them just fine, because they're winning very effectively. And the fear that some have expressed that there is some sort of Ukrainian secret army being created in the far west of the country, ready to sweep across the battlefield and take out the Russians, as the more shall we say, fantasy-obsessed Ukrainians on Twitter and Telegram think, I just don't think is a reality. The Ukrainians are already sending men as old as 70 to the front line. You don't do that if you've got some kind of reserve. Bear in mind, millions of Ukrainians, including many combat-aged men, have already fled the country. You can actually see pictures of these guys, a lot of tough guys with Azov tattoos on, starting fights in Polish streets. Apparently, they didn't fancy going to Valhalla just yet. But the Russian operation is not only sustainable in terms of them being resistant to the sanctions, This is also what is most politically sustainable for Putin himself. As I said before, the man remains a very cautious leader who operates via building consensus within the Russian capitalist class and within the Russian state. And the operation as he is running it at the moment, as it's being, well, he is instigated that his generals are delivering, is not only working, it is working in a way which will deliver their objectives. It is destroying Ukraine's military capacity. It is destroying the most dangerous elements of that, which is the neo-fascist organizations, who are not only being destroyed militarily, their reputation politically is being destroyed. The mass surrender at Azovstal is doing that. And so where will this go? They're going to continue to advance in this slow roll way. They will continue to move towards, I think eventually they will have to surround and take Kharkov, which the Ukrainians will try to turn into another Mariupol. But then again, Mariupol was a catastrophic failure. And so Kharkov will be taken. And then we will see them turn to the west, I think, to try and take Odessa and eventually completely cut what is left of Ukraine off from access to the sea. And therefore, of course, you will see the beginning of what is termed Novorossiya, which is the region of the coastal area of what is now Ukraine, soon to be Russian territory. And they will leave Ukraine with a rump state, however big that is, who knows, that is essentially a basket case. Now, some say, and the Russian nationalists are certainly saying that, and this is, if you look at what people like Alexander Dugin say, they are all saying that the Russians have to take Ukraine in its entirety, or they have to take at least Kiev because of course Kiev, very important, being the founding place of, or one of the founding places of Russian civilization, as the Russian national mythology would see it. That's where the Kievan Rus came from. And so they're saying that it's important that the Russians take that. Maybe they will. At the moment, though, I think that what will happen is that the Russian army will get down to Odessa, take that, go up to the border with Transnistria, as various Russian officials have been saying, and then they will probably pause there and wait to see if any of the Europeans or the Americans, but I doubt the Americans will negotiate, if the Europeans are now in a position where they're prepared to force a negotiation. Now, the Italians have come up with a peace plan that was something which anybody could have dreamed up before any of this started recently. Macron is making noises about the need for a negotiated settlement. The Germans are looking terrifically uncomfortable and rather contradictory. The German government is a complete mess. It's a shit show. It's composed of this incredibly incompetent buffoon named Olaf Scholz, who is the nominal chancellor. You got Annalena Baerbock, this idiot of a Green Party politician, who are both screaming that they don't want Russian oil anymore, but actually they do, and also they don't want nuclear power anymore. So what the hell German industry and German industry is going to be powered on, and what the hell German homes are going to be lit by, who knows? But Macron and Draghi, being a little more serious, are trying to push towards some sort of negotiation. The big stumbling block is, of course, though, that the British and the Americans, who are the principal movers when it comes to these things, don't want any kind of negotiation. And I should point out, this is not basically because the British and the Americans are planning to deploy any troops to Ukraine or intervene in any way. Neither of these countries has any intention of sending a single man to openly die in Ukraine. They may send they're probably sending special forces. They're trying to train a Ukrainian. They're actually trying to train a Ukrainian insurgent force, which is what all those Israeli trainers who are posting ill-advised videos about this are doing at the moment. But they're not going to send forces into Ukraine, despite the most fervent desires of like wild Tory backbenchers and the most idiotic elements of the British and the American imperialist left want to. The people who are actually in charge of the British military know very well that the British military has basically very little or almost no independent operating capacity on the scale that would be needed to intervene against the Russian army. Not my words, but the words of a former British general who testified a few weeks ago in front of our Westminster Parliamentary Defence Select Committee. Even the British right-wing magazine, The Spectator, ran a piece in November of 2021 observing that the British Army now had less independent operational capacity than ever before, that it was essentially operating as an adjunct of the United States Armed Forces. And so what is Britain, is the almost non-existent British Navy and Air Force going to make an appearance? Britain got rid of its aircraft carriers. It now has aircraft carriers with no aircraft on it. It has to borrow them from the United States. We have no mass army anymore. The armed forces, the army is officially around about 80,000, but how much of that can actually be deployed is another question. Now, the US, of course, is NATO. It is the one with the only sizable army that can be actually have a stand a reasonable chance of actually going toe to toe with the Russians. But even they, if you look at what's actually going on inside the US, clearly the military commanders don't want to get involved in a war with the Russians. Clearly, Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, doesn't have much of an interest in that, nor does Lloyd Austin, which is why he was on the phone to Sergei Shoigu the other day demanding a ceasefire, which they didn't get. And I think the Russian commanders know all this. They know that the armies of NATO are not capable of fighting them. And also not only not militarily capable of fighting them, but politically incapable of mobilizing the forces that would be required to take on the Russian army and Navy and Air Force. The British General Barons, who testified in Parliament, said that any British force that got deployed in Ukraine would be destroyed by the Russian Air Force within a week, within 2 days, I think he said. And that the British Air Force would have absolutely no way of resisting that. Not big enough, not got enough planes. Actually be able to deploy the American forces and have domestic support to do it, well, that's an open question. I watch or dip into quite a lot of American news, and it seems that the CNN, NBC, MSNBC is going full on with the anti-Russian propaganda, but it doesn't seem to be working on American public opinion. Maybe that's why they tried to appoint that lunatic Polish woman to be in charge of disinformation spotting. Bottom line is, there's also no economic capacity to launch some sort of mass war against the Russians. I know the Poles keep Warsaw and the loonies in the government there and society keep screaming about that they want to take over bits of Ukrainian territory. The Polish nationalists want to reoccupy Galicia that they lost, 80 odd, 90 odd years ago, and restake their historic claims to bits of what is now Ukraine. But of course, every time this comes up, the Poles have asked the Americans, if you believe we'll back you politically, but it's got to be a coalition of the willing, just like George W. Bush had. And the Poles can't find anybody to go in with them because no one agrees with them to do this. There's also talk that the Romanians were going to try and occupy Transnistria and seize land there, and that didn't happen because none of these nations can agree with each other on what risk they're prepared to take. Because as Putin made clear when he started this operation, if you attempt to interfere, you will face retribution, the likes of which you have not seen before. And that doesn't mean nukes, but it does mean that the Russians will, at this stage, attempt to destroy any NATO armed force which moves in. And if it's not an armed force, and if the Poles can't get the United States to back them militarily, then the Polish government is not going to move into a war with the Russians, because Poland is not capable of fighting a war with the Russians, no matter what some rather silly Polish right-wingers think, or some even sillier British right-wingers seem to think. They seem to think that the Poles are super soldiers who can roll over and be in Moscow in 2 days. It just isn't true. Now, there is another point that is raised by those who are saying that the slow rolling of the Russian military operation is encouraging all kinds of wild behavior. And that's true to a certain extent, certainly encouraging wild behavior in Warsaw and the various lunatically reactionary fuck-ups that run the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. But it's not really encouraging wild behavior on part of the Russians. If you look at how the Russian government spokesmen are handling themselves, they seem to be very calm about the whole thing. Now, of course, it's the job of a national leadership at a time of war to remain calm and put a calm and resolute face on things. But these don't seem to be men that are panicking. And as I said, they have no reason to. They're winning. And the longer this goes on, and they can run this war, even under full sanctions, for about a year, apparently, before serious effects start to be felt. Bellingcat said that they were going to run out of missiles. No, they're not. Various other Western media outlets high on copium said that they were running out of various parts of different military machines. Turns out they have a stockpile of what they need for at least a year. And of course, they have independent supply lines, which aren't subject to the interference of America, Britain, and the other Western nations. So they can go as slow as they want. And the longer this goes on, the more divided NATO gets, the more rows break out inside the EU over what the fuck they're screaming that they stand for Ukraine. They don't really. They really don't. President Jesus asked, thoughts on the speculation that preparatory work is being done for partial mobilization in Russia? I've been seeing reports like that since really mid-March. I don't think they're going to do it for now. I think that they are going to get to the end of what they want, which is to take everywhere down to Odessa, as Hackney Gyre observes, and the land bridge to Crimea and the two republics of Donetsk and Lugansk and up to Kharkov. And then they will see what the Ukrainians, or really the West, wants to do next. At that point, they may well try some kind of negotiation again. It may be that Putin and his faction in the Kremlin will then assess what Russian public opinion is like, what the remains of Ukraine is likely to be capable of. Bear in mind also, as this is going on, the West is looting Ukraine in return for the very generous donation of $40 billion, which was passed through the Senate just today. If you're an American, you may want to write to Bernie Sanders and thank him for his wholehearted support of that. And of course, the rest of the clowns in the Democratic Party and the dribbling idiots in the Republican Party. They've thrown 40 billion at this thing, but they're making sure that their priority is extracting all the wheat that is grown in Ukraine. Of course, the Americans are paying the salaries of the Ukrainian army, or at least a bit of the Ukrainian army that is being paid. They're throwing all these weapons into it, but of course, if you've looked at the history of the American operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, just resources turn up in that area. I mean, just look at the early days of the Iraq occupation when they were sending pallets of dollars shrink wrapped into the country, only for those gigantic amount of dollars to mysteriously disappear. We're already seeing like a lot of reports, and I would call at least some of these credible. A lot of this weaponry that's being transported into Ukraine is just being taken straight off the tarmac into various arms dealers and being sold by Ukrainian officials to arms dealers and being transported out of the country again. Ukrainian frontline servicemen are already selling it to the Russians. This isn't going well. And the smarter of them inside Washington mainly, London's far gone on its own delusions, know that it isn't going well and know that this is going to eventually, the Ukrainian state is going to collapse, barring the Americans just basically taking the whole thing over directly, which I don't think they're going to want to do. Though they are apparently various, Ukrainian Telegram channels were talking yesterday about the fact that now the Washington Pentagon men and London want to take direct charge of the Ukrainian army even more than they are doing already. And this is due to the rows that have been going on between Zelensky and the Ukrainian General Staff. The Ukrainian General Staff don't want to leave what's left of the Ukrainian army to get encircled inside the Kramatorsk area. They want to get out of Slavyansk and some of the other cities there and withdraw to a more defensible position in the west. And Zelensky, though in reality London and Washington, keeps blocking this. And why do they do that? There's many motivations, of course, for any action that any political figure takes, but the principal reason why they don't want, why they want to keep Ukraine in the field is because partly because they believe their own bullshit, that this is going to drain Russia of men and equipment and resources, and that somehow if they keep the Russians fighting in the east, this will somehow improve their position in some way. It won't. Even bigger, or at least as big, is the idea that Washington and London are desperate to not be seen to be losing. A tactical withdrawal to the west would be seen to be losing, and they're much more concerned with perceptions in this war than the actual reality. And I will give you a concrete example of what that means. Remember Snake Island? Remember early in the war where there was that meme-worthy moment produced by probably a British PR firm operating in Kiev, where they played this audio of a Russian warship apparently demanding that the brave defenders of Snake Island, which is this very small rocky outcrop off the coast of Ukraine, or what's now Ukraine, near Odessa. Russian warship says surrender. Ukrainian brave defenders say Russian warship, fuck off. Ukrainian defenders apparently all die, but they didn't. They all surrendered and got taken prisoner by the Russians and turned up later in a Russian POW camp. I think they got traded for Russian prisoners. Zelensky was awarding these dead men awards, and it turned out they were all alive. Now, recently, just before the May 9th Victory Day parade in Russia, the British and the Americans, principally the British, cooked up a scheme and sold it to Zelensky that they were going to try and retake Snake Island in order to have a big Ukrainian triumph on Victory Day, and thus owning Putin epically. I don't know what this was supposed to do, but it turned out to be a disaster. The Ukrainians tried to launch an operation with a lot of aircraft, a series of helicopter landings of troops, a lot of Turkish Bayraktar drones that were given to Ukraine by Erdogan, all launched at the island only to have the shit shot out of them by Russian naval forces. The entire thing was a complete disaster. I think most of the attacking troops died, apparently with NATO advisors, though that's not confirmed. And the whole thing was a disaster. And why? Now, there is some, if you read I think the guy who's good on this is a guy called Gleb Bazov on his Telegram channel, is arguing that the island does have apparently military value in terms of if you were able to install anti-ship missiles on there, you could theoretically reach the Russian Black Sea Fleet in harbor over in Crimea. But it's a hell of a lot of people and resources to waste on what was essentially a propaganda operation. But that tells you all everything you need to know about how the British and the Americans are looking at the war. It's a series of attempts to convince people that Ukraine is winning. It's not a serious operation to enable Ukraine to beat the Russians in the field. That's not what they're doing. It does rather open up an awkward question for the British and the Americans, which is they were clearly behind the push to get Ukraine to attack the Donbass and try and retake Crimea, but they apparently didn't seem fit to build up Ukraine's Navy or Air Force. The two things that could have actually combated Russian air and sea power or counteracted Russian firepower advantage on the battlefield, they didn't do. Interesting question as to why. I haven't researched it enough to give a firm opinion on that yet. But anyway, so this is what the Americans and the British are concerned with. Meme victories. And they've had a lot of those so far. Remember the Ghost of Kiev? That went well. And then somebody was arguing, I think it was in the Washington Post, that there were even though the ghost of Kiev didn't exist, that we should be allowed to pretend that he exists because people enjoyed it, which pretty much sums up all of Western policy now. So, to bring this to a conclusion, I think that the Russian operation will carry on until August to September time. Unless, of course, we do reach the point where the Ukrainian military starts to full-on collapse. The Ukrainians will attempt to bring to bear a lot of this equipment that they have been given by the NATO countries. This will largely be unsuccessful because, as various people have pointed out, various military professionals have pointed out, being given all this shit is not the same as being able to use it. To be able to integrate all these different bits of equipment into a coherent fighting force takes a lot longer than the time the Ukrainians had. And also, you need men to be trained on it, and then you need to ship it out east to where the battlefield is without it getting blown up by the Russian Air Force or a cruise missile on the way there. What the Russians seem to be doing at the moment is they're waiting for the depots in the west, in Lvov and Kiev, to be filled up with equipment, then just bombing them. So what is the actual American strategy here? The only thing I can conclude is that the American military and American intelligence men know that Ukraine is sunk. And what they are doing now is they are looking at building a terrorist insurgent army, which they are going to launch as an operation after the Russians have conquered the coastal area and the other areas of the east of the country we were talking about before, the Donbass areas, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kharkov. And that will be their objective, to run an insurgency campaign. This is not about Ukraine winning on the battlefield at all. Everybody knows that Ukraine is losing. The only people who don't are like crazy American liberals who have got the Ukraine flag in their bios and people who are paid to say otherwise. Maybe when they deploy the Malcolm Nance division, all of this will change. Who knows? But I think that is the ultimate aim here. And what the Americans and the British and the Israelis are training now is an insurgency force for after the Russian conquest is finished. It is just now a question of when the reality on the battlefield finally makes its presence felt in the Western sphere. If the Ukrainians are sending out 70-odd-year-old men in their 60s to go and fight out east, that is not an army. That is not an army which is building up a hidden reserve somewhere. That is an army on its last legs. You don't need to be a military expert to know that. Just read the history. The idea that they have got some secret hidden force being developed is that's just myth making. I don't think that that's real. Too many Ukrainian men of fighting age have fled. Too many are dead. Now the question is then, once the Russian takeover of these areas has been completed, what happens then? Well, I think that initially the Russians will have their eye on just freezing the conflict, stopping where they are, consolidating their gains. Essentially, then, if the Ukrainians do try to make a move, just bombing anything that comes near, threatening their frontline positions, and bombing any Western military equipment that's trying to be moved into place that could threaten them. And then what do the Europeans do? What do the Americans do? Bear in mind, if this is August or September, we already are in, economically speaking, in the United States and Britain and Western Europe, a developing economic crisis. And of course, capitalism is always a crisis, one way or the other. Capitalism is crisis. But we are developing signs of a bear market in the United States. There's all kinds of signs of severe economic problems on the horizon, both for Britain and the US. How long do they want to keep chucking money at this thing? How long do they want to keep sustaining the illusion in Ukraine? Now, eventually, it's going to reach a point in the United States where domestic political priorities will have to take over. It is at that point that the Americans will then pivot over to just running an insurgency. And they will then hope that the domestic political audience is too distracted by other things to notice that Ukraine has gone. fact, most of the American domestic political audience won't care, and rightly so. They have their own priorities to look forward to, look at. So now it is just a question of at what point do Britain and the United States principally stop propping up Zelensky? At what point does Zelensky flee to the mansion in Miami that he has? My guess is around about August or September. He can get over there for a new season of Colbert. He can play, him and Stephen can play Flight of the Bumblebee with their dicks on a piano. Maybe, who knows? But that's about the size of it. It is now just a matter of time. The slow war suits Russia's purposes just fine. To summarize what I've been saying and arguing about Putin, Putin remains the cautious leader he always has been. That is why he's using such limited force. And I don't think that he will come a cropper with that for now, because there is no way that the Europeans can economically, politically, or militarily go to war with Russia. Now, final point, just on the Swedes and the Finns deciding to jump out of the ice and into a frying pan, by joining NATO. What does Sweden and Finland joining NATO add to the mix here? Well, look at Putin's response and the other Russian leaders' response, like Lavrov. They've basically said that we oppose it. It's going to damage the relationship, particularly with Finland, where there's been neutrality for over nearly 80 years. Finland, they're moving nuclear-capable missiles to the Finnish border, which the Russians did demilitarize the Finnish border a number of years ago. But in terms of military, what does Finland and Sweden bring to NATO? Not a great deal. Nothing that the Russians couldn't handle. It does increase, of course, the potential threats to somewhere like Kaliningrad, the enclave of what was once Eastern Prussia, or old Königsberg, pre-World War II. Now a Russian enclave surrounded by the Baltic states. And of course, it does enable the United States to put nuclear missile carrying capable planes into airspace over Finland and Sweden. Whether they'll do that, that's another question. But the fact that Putin seems rather unconcerned with the Finns and the Swedes joining NATO, so that it's not the big coup that the US wanted it to be. It certainly doesn't seem to be changing the Russian strategic calculations in any meaningful way. And we'll see what the Russian response is. I think it'll just be a case of them remilitarizing the border slightly, and then nothing much other than that will change. They will, of course, fuck with the Finns on energy prices. That's probably the most likely outcome. But this idea that Finland and Sweden joining NATO fundamentally changes the game, I don't think it does. I don't think neither of these countries is going to start launching human wave attacks against the Russian border. Neither of these countries, again, to enter into a war with the armed forces of the Russian Federation would take a fundamental economic and political realignment in the major states of Europe that is just not happening at the moment, nor is it likely to in the near future. This is not, Germany and France in 1939. This is not Britain in 1939 or even Britain in 1982. These aren't states that are economically capable of waging some kind of destructive war, nor do they want to. They are morbidly afraid of what would happen in these states if they tried to do a mass mobilization for a war. That's why all of them have done away with conscription. They did away with the conscription in Britain in 1962. That was the final wave. My uncle was one of the last to actually get called up. We've been a volunteer military force in Britain for 60 years. And there's a very good reason for that, which is that, first of all, the British state couldn't sustain a mass infantry army. Britain's always been a naval power anyway. Now they're not even a naval power anymore. They're only a naval power if they can piggyback off the United States' naval power. And to suddenly launch into a situation where you're asking millions of combat-aged men to sign up to a war against the Russians, I don't think that the states of Western Europe, never mind Eastern Europe, have the strength, either economically or politically, to do that. They don't have the legitimacy to do that anymore. I think that if they tried to launch some kind of mass mobilization with no actual Russian threat on the horizon for them, that it would be met with mass resistance and it would eventually lead to the collapse of these governments. I think that people, the smarter of them, again, like Macron is smarter than Scholz. He understands that, and I don't think Scholz would even try it either. VV asks, what do you think of the ruble gaining more value after Western sanctions? Hilarious. But in economic terms, it reflects the fact that Russia's economy is infinitely stronger than the idiots in London and Washington thought it would be. And of course, they are actually expanding a lot of their trade with China, with India, with the Gulf states, that their oil trade is doing very well, that they have a huge trade surplus. Now, of course, the value of currencies does not dictate anything. And also the ruble getting higher priced ultimately could be damaging in terms of the cost of oil exports. But the fact is that the Russian economy is far stronger because Putin's project of actually making Russian economy sanctions proof, which he has carried out over the last 8 years, has been largely successful. And the fact that Russia's economy didn't collapse actually gained the ruble a lot of strength because suddenly the international investors and their herd-like mentality suddenly saw it as a lot stronger than they previously thought that it was. So it's likely to remain strong. What will it take for Russia to completely cut off gas to Europe? It would probably take the thing I've just been saying is not going to happen, which would be that the Europeans actively engage in direct military intervention in Ukraine or direct military intervention against Russia itself. In other words, a full-on war. At that point, they would cut it off. At the moment, they have no motivation to cut off oil or gas exports because A, it's making them a lot of money, and B, it's causing all manner of political contortions and rows and division within the EU and NATO. It's causing the Hungarians to fall out with the Poles. It's causing the Poles to fall out with the Germans. It's causing the Italians to switch to paying in rubles, which of course is what is a lot of what is behind the strengthening of the ruble, is the fact that the Russians are demanding payment for oil and gas in rubles, and then after saying that they wouldn't do it, the Europeans are falling in line and doing it. So there's an increased demand for rubles. What the deal actually is that the Europeans all set up an account with Gazprom's financial arm. They pay in euros, then it gets converted into rubles. That's increasing the demand for rubles. And the Europeans can say they're not paying in rubles, they're just paying into this Gazprom financial arm, which is then converting their euros into rubles. This is the kind of like ludicrous deal that always goes on to preserve everybody's face, but no one's fooled by it. So yes, they're not going to cut this off. It's making them too much money. It's bringing them too much political power to actually cut it off. It would take a full-on war for them to actually turn the tap off. People thought they might do it as soon as they invaded, but why would they? Look at everything that they have gained by keeping the supply going. They're basically destroying the unity, the fragile, delicate balance that within the EU is being destroyed. The balance, NATO has been revealed as being basically a paper tiger. They're winning through doing this. So no changing tactics likely to be there for now. I will wrap it up there for tonight. We'll see what we can do about the fragile internet connection for future live streams. Maybe I have to make a payment on my council tax bill. Who knows? But until we meet again, which should be by tomorrow, thank you everybody for tuning in, and I'll be speaking to you again soon.